Good afternoon. My name is Jim Daly. I'm Executive Director of the East Hampton Business Alliance. And today we're going to be listening to some experts on bluefin tuna. And our first speaker is Richard Rouet. Richard was the Executive Director of the East Coast Tuna Association, formerly a member of the New England Fisheries Council. This organization represents the commercial interests of giant bluefin tuna fishermen. Right. Richard, would you like to add anything?
Yes, thank you, Jim. We have East Coast Tuna Association represents about 350 bluefin fishermen from Florida up through Maine, and I think we represent all of the people that fish in the bluefin tuna fishery, primarily giant fishermen, but the work that we do, the independent research that we do, I think benefits that anybody that is involved in the bluefin fishery, whether it's school fish or giant bluefin tuna.
Okay, thank you. George Hochbruckner is the United States Congressman from the 1st District of New York. He was first elected to this position in 1986 and was recently re-elected. Congressman Hochbruckner has served on the Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committee since he first became a congressman. We'd like to hear from him today about the recent ICAT, that's International Commission for Conservation of Atlantic Tuna, meetings in Madrid, and also perhaps get some information on plans for the fishery industry with the new Clinton administration. Anything you'd like to add, Congressman Hochbruckner?
Yes, just that having served now as the congressman from the eastern half of Long Island for the last 6 years, clearly there's much work to be done out here, certainly in the area of the fishing industry. As you know, fishing and farming and tourism are the major concerns on the east end of Long Island. And certainly, having served now for 6 years on Merchant Marine and Fisheries, we have at this point 29 Democrats on the committee and 18 Republicans, and I was number 17 with the tremendous changes that did occur this year in the Congress, with about 25% of the Congress being replaced. I'm now number 10 on Merchant Marine and Fisheries, and so I think I'm in a better position to be helpful to the people of Long Island in terms of supporting this very important and very valuable industry here on Long Island. So I look forward to working with the Clinton-Gore administration and certainly with the new leadership on the committee to do our best to help our fishing community. And it's going to be very educational here today. I'm sure these gentlemen will be very instructive to all of us in terms of where we ought to be going from here in terms of our fishery.
Great. So we have a little seniority now on the...
Just a little, and getting better.
It's good. Okay. Our next speaker is Richard Stone. Richard is from the National Marine Fisheries expert on the highly migratory western bluefin tuna stock. He also recently returned from the ICAT, is that how it's pronounced?
ICAT, that's right.
ICAT meetings, where a further reduction of the harvest was agreed upon by members including Japan, Canada, and the United States. Richard, anything you'd like to add at this time?
Well, thanks, Jim. I just wanted to say that I'm with the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is part of NOAA, and we do have a new division that we're rather proud of, the Highly Migratory Species Management Division. And fortunately, we now have some staff to help out in getting some things done, so we're looking forward to doing more work on highly migratory species. And yes, you're right, I did attend the ICAT meeting, and there were some significant results from this meeting, and one of the things that was accomplished was what we started calling a certificate of origin, but now is a bluefin tuna statistical document, which will be useful in keeping track of where the catch of bluefin are coming from, because in the past there's been some catches coming from other countries that we haven't been able to keep track of. And we didn't actually make any reductions or any discussion of any reductions in bluefin for this coming year, but we will have an assessment, a stock assessment in '93 at ICAT, which will give us some information on what we need to do for '94 and '95, and of course I'll be happy to go into more detail as we go along.
Okay, thank you. Stephen Sloan is an avid sportsman holding numerous international game fish records made in the fishing capital of the world, Montauk. He is a trustee of the International Game Fish Association, the Bill Fish Foundation, and is an advisor to the National Marine Fisheries Service as a result of his appointment to the MAFAC Commission. And was that Mid-Atlantic?
No, that's MAFAC. Marine Advisory Fishery Commission.
Okay, Marine Advisory Fisheries Commission.
Right.
Anything you'd like to add?
Well, yes, I'm appearing here today in lieu of all those, but including on all those, as the chairman and founder of CAACC, which is the Confederation of the Associations of the Atlantic Charter Boat and Captains. And this is an organization, an umbrella organization that has 1,500 vessels, 10,000 jobs involved, $300 million worth of United States commerce, and represents the charter boat fleet from basically Florida to the Gulf of Maine. And people have always asked me, what's the best fishing hole in the world? And I have one answer, and that is Montauk, Long Island, because nowhere that I know about do 60 different species of fish swim and can be caught literally at different times, 12 months a year where you can go fishing. In addition to that, our association and the members of the Confederation, the charter boat industry, brings hundreds of millions of dollars to the East Coast, and especially to the eastern end of Long Island, where we, aside from the tourism, you have motels, hotels, the tackle shops, the bait shops, and all of the ancillary industries that are involved in charter boat fishing. We, by the way, also, all three of us, excluding the congressman, were at the ICAT meetings in Madrid, Rich, Dick, and I, and we can elaborate a little bit on that as we go along.
Okay, we'd like to hear that.
Good.
In East Hampton Town, I'm very involved and interested in the economic health and survival of East Hampton Town. And as Congressman Hochbruckner said, the traditional industries of fishing, agriculture, tourism, real estate, and the construction trades have all experienced, if not pressure and decline over the last 5 or 6 years, certainly challenges. And today I hope from an educational and informational perspective we can look at this issue and possibly educate our audience, provide information for our audience, and come up with some good suggestions for how this industry can help our local economy and the economy of Long Island as a whole. Why don't we begin with, again, starting with Richard Rouet. What is the state of the bluefin tuna industry today as you see it?
Well, I think that at least in terms of the economic value that bluefin tuna provides, it's very impressive. Just in the export market alone on giants, the annual value is somewhere between $25 million and $32 million a year. That's just for the giants alone. I think Steve could tell you quite a bit about how important charter boat and party boat fishing and private boat fishing is for the school fish and the medium, in terms of the number of crews that they employ and the number of trips and the bait and tackle owners, the mariners. There's a tremendous amount of that value, and that applies to the giant fishery as well throughout New England. It's not only the fishermen that benefit from this fishery, it's the support industries throughout the east coast of the United States that find tremendous value. And one of the good things about it is, at least in the form of the giant fishery, 95% of the product gets exported to Japan. So the value that's generated is a direct reduction to our trade deficit with that country. And we see the fishery as going through, it went through a very tough period in the late 70s, early 1980s, and because of the ICAT program that came into place in 1975, but was seriously tightened up in 1982, and then again in 1991, we see the stock as being on the verge of a very impressive recovery. We see the decline that took place in the 70s and early 80s has been arrested. And from the reports of fishermen, from their actual encounters on the water, we see very substantial schools of bluefin tuna coming back, and it's a good sign for both the industry and the recreational fishery.
Okay. Thank you.
What's the format? Can we jump in and talk at any
Sure.
time, or you're going to call Jim or I?
We're all friends here.
Sure, absolutely. Just to follow up a little bit on what Rich said, and Rich pointed out he was representing so many fishermen, and I'd like to think that we represent the fishery resource as well as the fishermen. And so in terms of the economics of the fishery, just to follow a little up again on what Rich said, we have an economist on our staff now who will be doing an economic analysis of the fisheries, both the commercial and the recreational fisheries. And this is going to be quite a task, and so it's going to require help from the fishermen in getting that done. But I know we've had offers of support, and so we look forward to doing that so we can get even a better handle on the value of that particular fishery. And again, following up a little bit on what Rich said, the resource itself, while we like to be optimistic and think that the resource is coming around, that still the best scientific information available doesn't point to I think, to being overly optimistic about the resource yet. I mean, we made some strides, and we think that there's still more that needs to be done, and so we're going to be looking very carefully at the assessments that we'll do in '93 to see what that shows to determine what should be done next. But the U.S. had a position last year before we went into the ICAT meeting of looking at a 50% reduction, and that 50% reduction was based on looking at what will happen with the resource over the years to come. And unfortunately, right now, with the data that are available, it doesn't look that good. The 87-year class was a little bit better than average, but certainly much lower than if you go back into the 70s, what it was like. And as that passes through, there's no other good year class around it. 86 was record low, and 88 was record low. But again, we're hoping that that we will see some good signs, and that the resource will recover, and that's what we're striving for.
There are, if I could jump in, there are differing interpretations over how to interpret the scientific assessment that's conducted by ICAT with an awful lot of input from the scientists of the National Marine Fisheries Service located in Miami. We think that the assessment itself there are some problems with it. There have to be some fundamental flaws with it because it's not reflecting what fishermen are finding on the grounds, and these are the same fishermen who were fishing the resource when it was almost in a virgin state back in the 60s and 70s, pilots who were flying over the resource and knew what it was back then, and now are doing the same thing 25, 30 years later, and what they're encountering today. And part of the problem may very well be the rod and reel survey that's used by the scientist in order to gauge it. There's just inherently, we think there's a problem with looking at 10,800 permits that are out there right now and trying to randomly survey that group when we know that there's only about 600 fishermen on average from 1983 to 1990 that catch the fish. We think a better way to survey the stock, at least to develop this measure of an index abundance, would be to go to those people that know how to catch the fish consistently and survey them rather than asking the remaining 10,000 permit holders. The quality of effort is not that good across the board, and we think that it's one of the reasons why the assessment is not reflecting what we're finding on the fishing grounds.
Maybe we can revisit that issue in a couple minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I would certainly hope so. Because I have, as
let me
Rich
ask-
knows, a 180-degree view of that.
Well, I'd like to hear that.
Yeah, why don't
I
you-
have a
okay.
comment too.
I wanted to get an overview, though, if you have any, if you and Congressman Huck,
You really have to define some terms here. Rich's fishery is for giants, because giants are sold to Japan, and primarily Japan is interested in the fat giant bluefin tuna, which reaches 0.001% of the population, where it's served in the Sumitomo Life Tower or the other executive suites. It's far beyond the reach of the average Japanese, and this is a luxury item, selling as much as $250, $300 a pound when it gets to Japan. So his fishery is geared to the giant fish, and he has his purse seiners, and he has his pinhookers, and he has his harpooners that are looking for the giant fish. Now, it takes about 7 or 8 years to become a giant. Our people fish for the school fish, 15 to 66 pounds. We take 6 people on the 6-pack boats and up to 50 people on the head boats out of Montauk and out of Shinnecock and out of sometimes out of Connecticut and Rhode Island and the other areas that we fish for these fish, New Jersey, and way down to the Virginias. And we like action. Our people pay $500 to $750 a day to get some action on the 6-pack boats. We want school fish. We let a lot of them go. We practice conservation. There's tag and release programs all over the coast. However, the science that has been paid for by the members of ICAT, plus the United States taxpayers, shows, and I have the graphs with me, that every graph is down on the 3 to 5, down on the 6 to 8, down on the 10-year plus. And these are not recovering. We are bottom fishing at the lower end of the graph. They haven't swung up to the middle yet. They're still down. And the anecdotal data, and that's what it's called, is sight data. A fellow says, I see a lot of fish. Well, if I was sitting in a bathtub and I had a lot of fish swimming around me, I would say there's a lot of fish around there. However, if that bathtub was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, that is not a lot of fish, because there's an awful big body of water around that bathtub.
If I could jump in a little bit here, and I think the thing we want to do here, of course, is to educate people a little bit about some of the issues and some of the problems. And I think what everyone is saying is true, but there's just more to the picture. And I think to get back to the data that both Steve and Rich have been talking about, it's very important that we get good data on fisheries, because we have to manage fisheries using the best available data. And it is important to get what we might call anecdotal data. It's important to know, what the fishermen see. But by the same token, it's also, we have to use surveys, and we have to collect data. We have to collect what we call fishery-dependent data. That's what the fishermen are catching. And then we like to use fishery-independent data as well, like aerial surveys or small fish indices that we use by towing devices to collect eggs, things like that. We have to use all the data we have available to us. And when you go over to ICAT and when the assessments are done, you put all these data together. So it's very important. And Rich, it's also important to know what people aren't catching as well as what they are catching. I mean, if you just take what the good fishermen are catching, that skews the data, that biases the data somewhat. You have to know what people aren't catching as well. But the large fish survey that we do is very important, because we have a large fish indices that we use to help tune the assessments. The small fish survey is very important to us too, because we have a small fish indices. These are the two key indices that we use in tuning the assessments. And so data from all the fisheries are important to us. We want to know what's happening with the small fish, with the medium fish, and with the giant fish. So I think it's important to recognize we all need to work together, to get the job done. And while there are some differences in opinions about how accurate data may be, we need to continue to improve the data and get the best possible data, because the scientists use that data in their assessments, and we have to use the results from the assessments in management.
I would like to serve something up for the congressman, because it is a very important part of this. Under the Magnuson Act, there is a law in effect today that says that the Secretary of Commerce, i.e. NOAA, i.e. National Marine Fisheries Service, cannot pass a law greater or lesser than what ICAT passes. So therefore, we have this condition where the United States goes to Spain. We all were at the meeting. Very well conducted, high level of expertise. But what comes back is something that we have to live with, good or bad, for the American fishermen. I know the Magnuson Act is coming up for review. Important part of fishery legislation. Query, if the member countries pass something that is against the United States fishermen policy for Rick's group or my group, under the present legislation, we have to go along with it. And this is part of what you're going to be involved in the review of the Magnuson Act, and also fine-tuned to what's happening along this coast and the money that Rick gets for exporting the fish and we get for selling a day's pleasure at sea. And by the way, we take about 5 million fishermen fishing a year in our association. So I'd love to hear what, you're on the Fisheries Committee, what your ideas about that is.
Yeah, well, first off, let me just step back for a minute. As you can tell, just from the opening remarks, this is not a straightforward area where everyone's in agreement.
Well,
and certainly,
we wouldn't be here if it were.
the problem that we have in government, of course, is that ultimately, as Steve rightly points out, this year the Magnuson Act is up for reauthorization.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the Magnuson Act of 1976 for myself and for other viewers?
Well, essentially, its purpose was to control the fisheries, and it did a variety of things, including setting up 8 regional fishery councils, and of course we're served by the Mid-Atlantic Marine Fisheries Council, of which includes the 6 states from New York down through Virginia. And so essentially what happens on those councils is that the governor makes nominations, but ultimately the Secretary of Commerce makes the appointments. And so these folks get together and decide how to in essence, control the fish in the particular region. Now, the problem with tuna, of course, is it's a migratory species and consequently just passes through. And while we do affect out to 200 miles from our coast, obviously what goes on in the rest of the world is of great importance to us, but not directly controllable by those councils. Now, that's not to say that might not change, because with the Magnuson Act up for reauthorization, there are a variety of things that could in fact change based on history. And so I think Steve's point is well taken, you know, that we have to look at the entire picture here to see what changes would make sense. And from my perspective, with this lack of, you know, agreement on whether the fishery's in trouble or not in trouble to begin with, you can imagine the problems that we in government do have, because our problem is ultimately we must strike balances. And clearly we have relationships with other nations, we have treaties with other nations, and so what we're trying to do here is to meld into a rational policy what might turn out to be treaty relationships versus laws that the Congress might pass, that the President would sign, to try and make all of this work together. So, Steve, I don't really have an answer to your question other than to say that since the Magnuson Act is up for reauthorization this year, that clearly representing the eastern half of Long Island and clearly the major impact that the fisheries industry does have on our economy, clearly I have to be extraordinarily open to all of the inputs that are coming at me, as different as those inputs may be, to try from it to come up with some kind of rational policy that in fact does, for example, help us with our trade imbalance.
Sure.
We have close to a $50 billion trade imbalance with Japan alone, and obviously the more tuna we can sell them, the more we'd love to sell them, provided it all fits in with you know, from big fish come little fish. And so obviously we're concerned about the entire fishery. And the first concern I think that we all share is that we have to maintain the fishery or everybody's in trouble. So we have to strike the balance between taking those steps that will maintain the fishery, both small and giants, and at the same time to do our best to capitalize on the economic gain that it does provide to us and the employment that it provides to many, many people. So, and Montauk is in fact the #1 fishing port in New York State, Shinnecock being second. So we're very concerned about these, and that's the difficulty I face, is trying to juggle all these balls and strike the appropriate balance. But let me tell you, this is the year where we all have to talk. We have to reach agreements, and the situation is further complicated by the fact that we have a new chairman on the Marine and Fisheries Committee. We have a new president, and consequently, there are many, many new players in the game, some not so new, but with increasing clout, and we have to meld all these things together. So it's going to be a very interesting year in the Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committee.
Yeah.
If I could just
Congressman, the interesting, our group and Rich's group, is, as you said, is the exporting side, and that's where they make their money. For the last 2 years, our group has been closed out on the last month of the season because Dick's surveys, and rightly or wrongly, a lot of fellows say we don't believe him, but he did his job. They did the surveys, they took the count, the chips fall where they were, and they had to close the season on the small fish. That is a disaster to the charter boat industry, and it's a disaster to the eastern end of Long Island, because A, the people go to the boat shows January, February, and March. You would pay me a lot of money not to go to a boat show. I mean, to sit there day after day and thousands of people and handing out brochures, then booking the charters, taking the deposits, in the expectation that you can go fishing again in October. You have the deposit, and then suddenly this uncertainty crops up because of the count, the quotas, ICAT, and all the other equations that are involved in this thing. We have the season closed twice. This is the most lucrative part of the charter boat industry. It's where they get paid the most fun, the highest rates, and to have a month closed was a disaster. Fellows had to give deposits back. They lost tens of millions of dollars along this coast.
No question.
So
the closures hurt, Steve, no matter which category you're in. And in the giant fishery, we've been experiencing those closures since 1982 in the various user categories, whether it's harpoon or the purse seine or the general category. I wanted to get back, though, to a point Steve made, just maybe a little clarification. The Magnuson Act and the Atlantic Tuna Convention Act don't prevent the United States from doing something that it feels is beneficial for its own fishery. And a good example is ICAT said we should have no economic gain from bluefin tuna under 66 pounds, and the United States said, well, we're going to expand upon that a little bit, and we're going to ban the sale up to about 235-pound fish. That's perfectly legit. It's final rulemaking. It's now illegal to sell a bluefin tuna in the United States if it's under 70 inches. The issue is, the other issue is, though, on the quota, the law also says that if ICAT provides the United States with an allocation of fish, U.S. fishermen should have a reasonable opportunity to catch that quota. And there's good reason for that. We can't manage highly migratory fish by ourselves. We've got many, many nations on the high seas that are fishing this resource. The United States is basically a small actor. If you look at the Mediterranean, the Eastern Atlantic, and the Western Atlantic combined, the entire Western Atlantic quota is less than 10% of what's being taken out annually. And that means you have to have international cooperation. And that means you have to deal in the international community where the objectives of management are a little bit more complicated than just looking at how the United States interprets an assessment or how fast the United States wants to get to its ultimate rebuilding goal. And I just want to make it clear, too, that we don't disagree that this fishery was overfished in the 60s and 70s, and it was mismanaged. We were taking too many fish, too many small fish, and too many big fish at the same time, and it knocked the fishery for a loop. Our contention is, though, that since '82, since actually '75, when the first steps came in, that we're making progress, moving in the right direction, and we need to continue it. And ICAT is a very responsible body. They've taken additional steps to speed up the recovery, and we're hopeful that ICAT will continue to do so.
And if I could respond just to the points that Steve made in very short,
Sure.
briefly. Steve, your point is well taken about, in essence, the quota causing our people to be shut down. And it seems to me, as I understand it, that part of the problem is that the New England folks, we feel, have taken a bigger piece of the quota and not leaving that much for us. And so it would seem to me one of the things that maybe we could work on is some negotiations or what have you with the New England folks to try and leave more fish for us, since they seem to grab a bigger piece of the available quota that is available to us. But recognize that's a problem because the chairman of Merchant Marine Fisheries
Right.
is
No, but
from
we don't
that
do
situation.
that.
Well, I have some
Congressman,
news.
we
I
don't-
have
we
some
don't-
interesting.
Steve,
I have some
then-
interesting news
Yeah,
for you.
right.
Steve.
In Madrid, at the first meeting, and Rick and Dick were there, I put on the table that I would approach Japan and Canada to option purchase /purchase 4,000 or roughly 60 tons of small fish that they don't use. This was kind of revolutionary. I spoke to the Japanese delegation about it. He said it was revolutionary. We're going to speak to Canada about it, and maybe there's a way. We want the season. That's most important to
So
the
you
charter
might do
boat
some
industry.
trading with
Yeah,
them.
right.
Maybe we can buy, trade, it's 4,000 fish is not they're only that big. Not a lot in the terms of the total. And by the way, they don't use it. Canada does
Gentlemen,
not
excuse
use
me,
it at
we're
all.
approaching our time
Ah.
limitations now. So why don't we finish by going left to right. Richard, if you'd like to make a half-minute summary.
Well, what I was going to
Okay.
do
Okay.
really is, rather than make any kind of summary, is just talk a little bit about the sort of the history and what all these groups. We've talked about small fish and about big fish, and we've talked about ICAT, talked about regulations, and I thought it might be useful just to go back over and talk about the tunas in general. We have bluefin tuna is a highly migratory species, and it ranges from probably Brazil. The species is known up in Newfoundland, Labrador. In other words, it does range up and down, and we consider it two groups. We consider a western and an eastern Atlantic spawning stock of bluefin, and so we have to deal with those. ICAT, which we've talked about, is an international organization of 22 nations. So there is a lot of negotiating that you have to do, and you have to work with the different countries as well as with your local interest in getting some things through. But
Okay, we're down to our last minute.
Okay.
Let's let Congressman Hochbruckner make some concluding remarks.
Well, since obviously this will continue and we'll have an
Right.
opportunity to go into greater detail in
Right.
terms of the point that you're making, and I think that's part of the education that is useful certainly to
Right.
all of us, and I look forward to that.
okay,
And
Yes,
Mr. Rouet.
the competition for the angling quota is not New England versus Mid-Atlantic or South Atlantic. The biggest fishery for the school fish is New Jersey, New York, and Virginia. And in New England, there's a small school fish fishery in Rhode Island and on Cape Cod, but we're not really in competition for that fish. I guess what Steve might be alluding to is he would like more of the U.S. allocation to be spent in the form of quota for small fish, and that's something that ought to be talked about and I'm sure the National Marine Fisheries Service is planning on talking about that. And it's something that if Steve eventually realizes we could be more allies than we are opponents, we might be able to come to a good resolution to that.
Okay. I understand that we're going to a commercial break now, and that we'll return in just a few minutes.
Very good.
These household pollutants play war with our marine environment. Don't attack our marine environment. Dispose of household pollutants properly. For more information, call Cornell Cooperative Extension.
Welcome back to our discussion of the bluefin tuna industry. And again, I have with us today Richard Rouet, Congressman Hochbruckner, Richard Stone, and Steve Sloan. And we're going to continue in the first half of our discussion. We got some introductory comments and an overview of the industry. Now we're going to continue with Richard Stone will describe the migratory.
Well, I thought just before we broke, I was talking about the fact that we are involved in ICAT. I explained a little bit about ICAT, that there are 22 nations involved in managing highly migratory species, tunas and tuna-like species in the Atlantic, and that sometimes it's a difficult form to work in, but that if you cooperate with the other countries, and as long as you have the science, that you can get things accomplished in that form. But what I think I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the domestic management scheme, so you understand. We've been talking about school fish and giant fish and whatever. We have different categories of fisheries in our management system, and one of the categories that we've been talking about has been the angling category, and these are fish less than 70 inches. Really, these are fish that are taken up and down the coast. Typically, the small fish occur first in the North Carolina, Virginia Capes area in May, late May, June through July in the Virginia Capes area. And most of the fish taken in that fishery are small. They're less than 66 pounds, and you might find them ranging from about 25 pounds up to 66 pounds, and occasionally you get a few fish larger than that. These are basically the school.
Is there a limit on?
There is. There are bag limits as well as quotas, and each of the categories, for instance, the angling category has a quota of 219 metric tons now, but that's broken down with 100 metric tons for school fish. These are fish less than 66 pounds, and there is also a break of that in the school fish fishery. We looked at historical catch rates, and we came up with a distribution between Virginia and states north of that is about even. So we split at New Jersey North and Delaware South, and we have 47 metric tons for the Delaware South area and 53 metric tons for the New Jersey North area. And some years, much of that catch has been taken in the Virginia Capes area, and other years it's been New Jersey or New York. Where
Is
that
that just
catch.
a function of where the
Well, it depends on water temperatures, availability of bait. Any number of factors can be responsible for where that distribution occurs. So anyhow, this year in the southern area, the fishery was slow, and so we only took about a little over 30 tons of fish in the southern area. Whereas when we got up in the northern area later in the year, then the fishery got hot, particularly in Montauk and off of the Connecticut, Rhode Island fisheries were hot. So they did reach their quota and actually exceeded slightly their quota, so we had to close that fishery down. You heard Steve mention about that. Well, these are fish, as I said, the 100 tons that have to be 8% of the country quota. Now, the fish larger than that, or part of the 219 up to about 70 inches. In other words, when you go from the 45 inches up to 70 inches, that season was not reached, but there were few fish of that size available. For instance, none in the Virginia area, and then sometimes they come in late in the year in the more northern areas. Now, going on to the other categories, the general category. Rich talked a little bit about the general category, and this is a giant category, and this is hand gear fishery. And they have 531 metric tons available to them. And typically we reserve 40 metric tons for areas south, because the fishery actually gets started, surprisingly enough, even though the schoolfish fishery sort of starts from the south and works north, the giant fishery really starts pretty much from the north and moves south. And so the real big fishery this year was up in Maine and New Hampshire, the northern part of Massachusetts, where most of the fish were caught this year. And actually we had to close the season down. And we took the 40 tons that we have in reserve and then opened up the area south of Cape Cod on down through the New York Bight. We had 20 tons for the area just south of Cape Cod, and then 20 tons for the New York Bight area, which would have been New York and New Jersey. And then we have a harpoon category, which is again is a giant fish fishery, and it has a fairly small quota of 53 metric tons. And let me back up. In the general category, you could only catch one fish per vessel per day. And if the season went very slow, we could up that to 2 fish, say. But in the harpoon category, which is a very small quota, 53 metric tons, they can take multiple catches per day. Now, that means that you could take your fish very quickly, perhaps, or the harpoon vessels could space it out. In this particular case, they did space their fishery out quite a ways through the year. And then we have a purse seine category, and there are 5 vessels in the purse seine category, and that's 301 metric tons. And these vessels operate Cape Cod Bay and in northern areas. So their season doesn't open until about August 15th, and so typically they can take their fish very quickly, although last year they didn't. They didn't, for some reason or other, because of the weather or whatever, they didn't take the fish. They didn't reach their quota, but typically they'll take their fish. And then we have an incidental catch category, which is basically the long line category. And this also is divided into a southern area and a northern area. Now, according to ICAT, we can't allow any directed fishing on bluefin tuna in the Gulf of Mexico. So we have an incidental, as I said, an incidental quota down there. And then once that incidental quota is reached, then that is closed. And that typically is closed fairly early because the bluefin are spawning in the Gulf of Mexico, and they typically move back down in there January, February, March, and spawn in perhaps April and May, and will move on up the coast right after that. So that fishery typically will close in March or sometimes April.
What is the prime season for off the shores of Long Island for tuna?
September, October.
September and October.
Well, the small fish, that's right. The small fish are typically September, October, and then the giants, though, may move back down into that area October or November even, or September, October, November. Frequently you'll see the giants that may move back into that area.
Now, your survey techniques, do you use sampling or?
Yes, we do. In other words, in the general category, or for the giant fisheries, we really keep track of commercial sale. We keep track of. We have dealer reports, and these are daily reports that have to be sent in, and then we have weekly summaries that are sent in. So for the fish that are sold commercially, we do have dealer reports, and we can keep quite accurate records of that. For the small fish fishery, it's spread over a large area of the coast. There's no particular ports. I mean, most any port, these fish can be taken. So we have to have samplers.
By the way, Dick, you pointed, these are not for sale. The small fish, not for sale.
That's
These
right.
are for personal
Take one
use.
home, personal
That's
use.
right.
Now
but
let me ask
not for sale.
Captain Sloan.
Steve Sloan.
Sloan. Over the last several years, the charter boat industry has been closed down.
October, basically.
Beginning of October.
Right.
And you've had bookings, you've had deposits for business through mid-November?
Into November,
Into
yes.
November. What steps on the part of the national regulatory bodies could be taken to facilitate you going? What are they doing possibly less than right that they could be doing better? Or?
Well, the first thing that impacted this fishery was the 8% ruling that came out of the blue, out of ICAT in November 1991. this was after, within 30 days or 45 days of a very bitter lawsuit that was started by the Montauk Boatmen and Chartermen's Captains Association, asking the government to close the entire fishery because frankly, the count that was taken was off. The service closed the fishery. The fellows affected in Montauk felt it was wrong. They went to court. The judge closed it for a week and then reopened it, and there was a great argument over discards. And the judge asked the question that still rings around that courtroom is, isn't a dead fish a dead fish? Well, it's a dead fish on one hand, and on the other hand, it didn't count toward these quotas. So somewhere in the middle, the judge reopened the season. However, the charter boat industry and recreational fishery, and don't undermine that. I mean, they contribute just as much as the charter boats do, but I happen to represent the charter boat people. So that fishery was closed in '91, and in '92, because of this 8% quota down, it was 8% of 1,300 tons, down from 15% of 2,600 tons. So it was a 75% reduction. The service did its job. They went out, Dick put people on the job, he hired consultants, they did their surveys, and frankly, 8,000 fish down from probably 24,000, not hard to reach, considering the early show in Virginia, and they come up the coast, and that's it. And we even cut it. We went and we worked with Dick. We said, okay, look, it was 4 a day per boat and the crew. So that was 32 fish on an 8-man, 6-pack plus 2 in crew. We cut it to 16. We cut it to 8, 1 a day. Then we cut it to 6 because we eliminated the crew taking a fish home. We still got to the 8,000 fish. The season was closed. It seems to me that the Department of Commerce, representing American industry, it's their job, and as well as Dick's, to find a way to get somewhere between 4,000 to 6,000 more fish in this fishery so the charter boat people can have their season, produce business for Long Island, produce reservations for hotels, motels, gas stations, ice, bait, charter, and the whole ramification of business and industry on Eastern Long Island. That's their job. We're working hard at it. This idea of buying some fish is something new. Frankly, I'm glad that I was the one that thought about it, and hopefully our members will get the benefit.
Gentlemen, we've been neglecting our friend
Yes.
on the right here.
Right.
Let's,
Okay.
Well, one point that I wanted to make was Dick talked about sort of the seasonality of the fishery and how in recent years it seems to have started down east off of Maine, and that's where the action takes place. In prior years, there have been years where it started off of New Jersey or started off of New York, and Canada experiences the same phenomenon of the fish. You can't predict exactly where the fish are going to show up, where they're going to come in, whether it's water temperature, whatever it is, it's feed, whatever it makes. But I think the thing to recognize about this fishery in the last decade is that the fishermen who pursue the giant fish travel to where the fish are. We have, if you talk to marina owners throughout New England, particularly on Cape Cod, up through Gloucester and Newburyport, and just come to those marinas in the summertime, and you'll be amazed at how many New Jersey, New York boats. Some of the biggest catches in the general category right now are made by New York fishermen from the east end of Long Island who come up to New England to participate in the fishery. So I think that from Florida. The boats come from as far away as Texas and Florida to fish in the giant fishery, and they come to New England because that's where the fish are coming now for whatever reasons. It could change, and I think historically that's why NIMS always held this 40-ton reserve, was to make sure we know that the fish also come back down in the latter part of the year, and that although they haven't in the last 4 or 5 years, they haven't been making themselves available in the Middle Atlantic Bight. But this too could pass, and the giant fishery could once again become centered right down here off of Long Island. And that's why it's important to recognize not just the regional perspective here, but the national outlook.
Well, that's true. Congressman, you had a good point a while back too about communications and the fact that we all have to work together, to try to get the job done, whether it be for the economic standpoint or whether it be for the research standpoint or whatever. One of the things that we're trying to do at the National Marine Fisheries Service is to improve communications, and we've set up a fax mail list which we try to get information out to people rapidly, and we've tried to increase the numbers of hearings and things that we hold and scoping meetings. And so I think it is very important, as you said, that we do communicate, particularly at this time. Now you've got the Magnuson Act reauthorization that you're talking about, and we're going to be involved in many different rulemakings, both not only for bluefin tuna but for other highly migratory species. So your point about communications was very pertinent.
And by the way, let me just say that, you know, I've certainly been the quiet one here today, but that's okay because I get TV time all the time. It's important that you guys who have the real information, who were at the meeting in Spain, are the ones who should be telling the public what's coming. But let me suggest this. I like Steve's suggestion that it appears to me that through international cooperation, we probably would be able to shift some of Canada and Japan's quotas into our column. That makes a lot of sense because it doesn't hurt the fishery, because by definition the quotas were set in a way to protect the fishery in the first place. And so therefore, if we cozy up to the quota levels that were laid out, it seems to me we're protecting the fishery, and at the same time would give us the opportunity certainly to have access to the fishery and the economics associated with it. So that sounds like a very good idea to pursue in terms of keeping the season open longer on the small and medium, and certainly you know, whatever we can do on the giant side on the trade imbalance would be useful too. So I think from my perspective this has been very educational. I've certainly learned something, and we need to talk some more about where we're going from here. And obviously, with the new Clinton-Gore administration coming in, not only with a new Secretary of State, as well as Secretary of Commerce, as well as NOAA and other personnel, it seems to me we'll have a new ration of players available to us, and hopefully, if we educate them appropriately, we might be able to, in fact, protect the fishery and at the same time enjoy the benefits of the economics of accessing that fishery.
Just for my information.
Jim, I'd like to interject a second, because 2 years ago, I thought this was a very bleak picture. I looked at Rick's group as taking the large fish, which are known spawners. The science shows that somewhere between 5 to 9 these fish spawn, which means they have to grow a bit to get them to sexual maturity. I was invited by the Japanese government to visit Ishigaki Island, which is 100 miles from Taiwan, to see their tuna hatching project. They actually raise tunas. They put them in this big, and now they weigh 300 pounds, not for food. They were waiting for a biomass so they could reseed the oceans. And I've had a constant dialogue with the Mr. Shima, who's Deputy General of Fisheries. Last, when I met you in Tokyo in the lobby of the hotel, I was coming back from Kushimoto, where they again, Kinki University, had developed this project. All of them failed. They could not get the fish over 2 centimeters up to 10 to put them back. This is a reseeding project. However, Taiyo Fisheries succeeded that week that I was there. That, to me, is one of the ways to handle this. I'd also like to report that ICAT this year, I think, was a success. Number one, through the government's leadership, and Dick and I were there to give whatever advice we could, we succeeded in getting an ICAT statistical data sheet where each tuna that's sold into the markets will now be able to be traced. That helps the science, it helps fishery management, it helps the stocks. But even more important, a resolution was passed where flags of convenient vessels are now going to be brought to the UN, where countries that are fishing outside the ICAT membership have been using Panamanian and Liberian and other flags, so they don't have to become a member and they don't have to report their catches. This hurts the professionals that really want to do their job. We all voted for this. Rick, this is one of the things we see eye to eye, and that is coming forward. So certainly out of this ICAT session, there was much progress.
I think there was, Steve. Just to follow up on that, there were other things, too, that came out of this meeting I think were very important. And one is that we agreed that we would look at what biomass, what the MSY level that we wanted to shoot for with bluefin, and a recovery schedule to get there, which is very important, not only for the Western Atlantic, but also for the Eastern Atlantic, too. And in the past, the Eastern Atlantic has been pretty much ignored. They said, well, you all worry about your stock level, and we'll just sit over here and not do too much. But I think it's very important that we look at very carefully what's happening in the Eastern Atlantic as well, because they take a lot more fish over there, but they also are fishing on zeros. I mean, zero-age fish, which is gives anybody concern. That's right. And they have purse seine fisheries on these fish, and so we got some agreement that that we should look at both the eastern and the western Atlantic in terms of the target goal and recovery schedule, which I thought was very good. The other thing that I was pleased about too, there were a number of things, but one was in the infractions committee, which has been pretty much ignored in the past. There was a very strong statement. I was pleased that the U.S. Made a very strong statement about making the infractions committee worthwhile and looking at some of these violations of the ICAT recommendations that have been going on. And so I think that that's something that's going to work, and hopefully it'll be very helpful in the eastern Atlantic, where there's been, as I said, they've been ignoring some of the recommendations that have been in place. So we also made some accomplishments, had some accomplishments on swordfish too, the same thing, looking at the target stock level that you wanted to try to sustain and a recovery schedule to get us there. So I think it was a very, very productive meeting, and we need more of that. The important thing is to go from the rhetoric, the base that was set, following up on it, make sure that we follow up on that. It's not just rhetoric, but that we do follow through, and the U.S. has to play an important role in making sure that other countries do this as well.
And I think the U.S. did. I'd like to take this opportunity to say that the 3 U.S. commissioners did an outstanding job, along with the National Marine Fisheries Service, to really put some heat on the Eastern European countries and the Mediterranean countries to say, look, in 1981, 82, you were supposed to freeze your fishery at this level. You were supposed to abide by the same 13.5 kilogram or 6.7 kilogram,
6.4, yeah.
6.4 kilogram minimum size. We deal in larger fish, so the smaller ones aren't quite, we aren't quite
That's what,
familiar
about
with.
13 pounds, 14 pounds.
About 13 or 14 pound fish, and everyone knows that over there has been zero compliance with those measures at all. And even if you accept the U.S. scientific view that there's only a rate of interchange, a 10% interchange between the fish that are over in the east and over in the west, it's very important that there be equivalent or complementary management on both sides of the Atlantic, because they are interrelated. And we've been feeling for a long time that, and I think there's some evidence that supports that the very restrictive regulations in the West, the U.S. industry, small fish, giant fishery, Canadian fishery, Japan fishery in the Western Atlantic have undergone a 65% reduction in total since 1982, and there hasn't been anything going on in the Eastern Atlantic and Mediterranean. They basically, they went through a little bit of a slow period, but after our regulations went into effect, things started to boom again. The canneries within the Mediterranean and some of the trap fisheries began booming again, and we believe that we're subsidizing the unrestricted fishing that takes place in the Mediterranean and the Eastern Atlantic. And this was a terrific year for ICAT, because I think it demonstrated competence in a lot of areas. I think you could, at any time during the meeting, you could look over at the Spanish delegation and they were shaking their head, because all this talk about management was supposed to be for the West, not for the East. And I think they realize now that they too have to make a contribution to the productivity of the resource.
Well,
What
you're
type
right,
of
Rich. I think
type of enforcement power does ICAT have? And if they don't have it, if it's not centered there,
I think Dick really
Yeah.
focused on it. It's pressure that results from things like an
Right.
infractions committee getting up and making very, very strong remarks that we have an obligation. If your country is a signatory to this international treaty, you have an obligation and a responsibility to see to it that the conservation regulations and measures of the body are enforced throughout your domestic fishery. And that's the kind of pressure that when you're at ICAT, the table is surrounded with the leading national fishery managers from each of the nation, and in some cases some of the political people are there also. So the right people are there.
Yeah.
You just have to get the message to them that it's important they cooperate. And ultimately, if they don't do it voluntarily, then there are other avenues
pressures on
that
them.
Well,
right.
the
we're
pressure,
going to be
Jay.
wrapping up the second half of our discussion in about 4 minutes.
Well,
so-
I've got a minute
Okay.
for you, but
Fair
there
enough.
is another pressure, and we were all aware of it, and that is called Denver 94,
Mhm.
where CITES meets. That's the Commission for the Trade in Endangered Species.
Mhm.
And last March, Sweden put the bluefin tuna on Appendix 1 listing, which means no export, no sale. And a deal was made where Sweden withdrew it, Japan, Canada, the United States retreated, met again in Tokyo in May, and was supposed to come up with further reductions, did not, claim science, and I'm not going to go into that. But the pressure is on the table that these countries have to be responsive to this issue, because Denver is not Kyoto, Japan. This is in the middle of the United States, where there are strong environmental community. conservation community. There are many at work, and I can list 5 or 6 of them on my hand, that are serious at work trying to get this tuna listed as an endangered species in Denver of '94 on the CITES program. So that pressure was on the table. I would like, when we come back, to respond to not only the bluefin tuna, but Dick is involved in other highly migratory species, and what really this means to the eastern end of Long Island. And we'll get back to that, I'm sure, in the next
Well,
segment.
I'm not sure
just
whether
one-
Boy, we don't have
We're
a
wrapping up.
I just want to
Well,
point
I'll
out,
wrap it up just
Yeah,
on that one. Look,
One-
I'll
we've
give
lost.
Steve my time.
Okay, we've lost white marlin, our fluke is down, our porgies are smaller, our butterfish is smaller, our sharks are now in trouble, where Dick is coming up with a shark management plan. Bluefin tuna represents the Cadillac of this fishery. We can save it. We can save it by intelligent management. I am not so sanguine about white marlin. I saw the charts at ICAT. There's a tremendous amount of long-lining incidental catch that's going on, and they are for sale in other areas of the country. They mean a lot to us, but they're food for other people. So we really have to concentrate on this. This is a comeback for eastern Long Island. It's fishery, it's business, it's fishing business, it's tourism, and the men and women that work, they're not rich. They work very hard at this business, and they're small business people.
Dick
Well,
Stone,
to
a
follow
summary.
up on what Steve
Thank you.
said, I mean, the National Marine Fisheries Service is very much concerned about the fishermen and the fishery resources. In other words, we want to see fisheries in the years to come, and we want to work with the commercial and the recreational fishermen to try to get the best possible data available and to be able to work effectively in the international regime. In other words, we want to be able to work effectively at ICAT. So it's going to take all of us working together. And Congressman, you, in terms of reauthorization of the Magnuson Act too, there are a lot of things that we'll be looking forward to working with you on as well.
Okay. You yielded your time, but we have 1 minute left, 30 seconds, or did, we'll go ahead and go to Richard.
Well, okay, I just point out that I don't believe that the fishery needs further quota reductions. We are on the right path. Further quota reductions will be hurt terribly the businesses that Steve represents, and it'll also hurt the people that I represent. And many of those fishermen, bluefin tuna, if they catch 1, 2, 3, a half dozen a year, it's extremely important. Yes, it's a valuable product, but there aren't very many alternative fisheries in New England for those fishermen to pursue right now, and bluefin tuna is a relief valve right now for fishermen that have historically been in the groundfish fishery. They come into the fishery in June, July, August, and it's a very important source of revenue for them. And I think ICAT has demonstrated, and unlike Steve, we don't worry so much about CITES now. The 1992 ICAT meeting took away any legitimacy for CITES involvement whatsoever. We've got the trade situation. The certificates of origin will probably result in an additional 35% reduction in mortality. We're on the right track. We need to allow this program to continue.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I found this very educational, and there seems like there's some hope here. Some lines of communication have been started, and I hope we can continue with these through the next year and the important decisions that are going to be made.
Thank you.
We like the
Yeah,
congressman
that's
for
right.
his minute. We like to thank him.
Yes, okay. Good afternoon. My name is Jim Daly from the East Hampton Business Alliance, and we're here today to conduct a panel discussion on the striped bass industry. The East Hampton Business Alliance monitors the economic profile of East Hampton Town, and certainly among the important industries which have suffered in the last few years is the fishing industry, along with agriculture, the building trades, retail, the hospitality industry, and real estate. We have a number of experts from different areas of the striped bass industry, and let me introduce them to you. First, on my right is Captain Joe McBride. Joe is president of the Montauk Boatmen's and Captains Association, and he's a charter boat captain himself. Joe, any other biographical information you'd like to?
That will suffice. The rest I'm embarrassed to have to bring out publicly.
Okay. Next, we have George Skoka. George is president of United Gamefish Anglers and also publisher of Northeast Saltwater, a sports fishing magazine. George, any other biographical information?
Well, again, I guess that sums it all up.
Okay. Okay. Next, we have Captain Ralph Pastori. Ralph is founder and executive director of the United Fishermen's Association. Ralph, anything you'd like to? Everyone's a little shy here, but let's tell us a little more about yourself, if you'd like.
Well, I could say a little more about the association. Our association is basically made up of West End handline fishermen and West End party boat interests, as well as charter boat interests. And the charter boat and really the party boat interests also are throughout the state. We have some interest in Montauk as well.
Okay, thanks. To my left is Art Newell. Art is Assistant Director of Marine Resources for the DEC. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And would you like to add any biographical information?
Well, I could say that the Division of Marine Resources is responsible for the management and protection of striped bass, as well as other finfish and crustaceans, and also all the living marine resources and their habitat in the state of New York.
Okay, thank you. Our final panelist is Arnold Leo. Arnold is Secretary of the East Hampton Town Baymen's Association. Anything you'd like to add, Arnold?
I've also been on the board of the Coast Alliance, a national environmental group, for the last 12 years, and recently have been appointed to a newly formed environmental group called the Ocean Trust. I'm on the board of that also.
Good. Well, thank you all for coming today. I know that this is going to be a learning experience for myself. I hope to be informed and educated with concerns to the striped bass industry, and I'm sure that our viewers in the audience today also will benefit from your knowledge, expertise, and experience. Let's begin with Arnold, since we ended there, and just if you could give us a brief overview of the striped bass industry before we get into any specific topics. And we'll go right along the panel.
Sure. When you say the striped bass industry, I'll, of course, speak only for the netters, the traditional striped bass fishermen on the east end of Long Island, who are part of a 300-year-old fishing community and who use nets to catch striped bass. In particular, a kind of net called a hull seine, but also nets called pound traps and gill nets. And these fishermen, in the many years that striped bass have been important as a market fish, have been providing about 70%, roughly 60 to 70% of the striped bass that go to the market in New York State. And that was previously a very important part of the Long Island economy, especially the East End. Today, these men are actually prevented by law from fishing in their traditional manner, and their way of life, in fact, is threatened. And there is indeed a danger that within this decade, we'll see the end of the traditional fishing community in East Hampton on the east end of Long Island, unless remedial actions are taken, which we can discuss.
Okay, thank you. Art, just get from your perspective an overview on the striped bass industry or the fishery.
Perhaps what I'll give is a little bit of background.
Sure.
Perhaps why we're here today. The New York State Legislature passed a law authorizing the department to regulate, and regulate has specific meaning. That is, issue regulations to manage striped bass in New York State. And in that law, it states that the department shall, our authority is restricted to promulgating regulations that are consistent with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission Fisheries Management Plan for striped bass. And that's a plan that covers basically the whole East Coast, the range of the East Coast population of striped bass. And that plan contains in it measures that essentially restrict fishing both commercially and recreationally in order to restore the stock on the East Coast. And essentially, at this point, because the stock was so significantly reduced when the plan was put in place in the 80s, the first objective was to recover the stock. The plan calls for a limit on mortality of 0.25. And right now, at a 0.25 mortality, that basically means that fishing, both recreationally and commercially, should be not exceed 20% of what it was historically, and the historical period we're talking about is the 70s. So the regulations that we have promulgated, the division, the department, are basically intended to achieve that limit on mortality in New York State. And over the past couple of years, we've fine-tuned them, and the quota was increased this year. The year we're in now, the season that commercial season we just ended, went from 120-something thousand last year pounds, that is, to 189,000 pounds, because the size limit, the slot limit increased because the fish got cleaner. Well, we had data indicating that they were cleaner, and so they were allowed to fish commercially in a larger slot limit, which, according to the plan, when fishing in a larger slot limit, the 189,000 pounds this year is biologically equivalent to 120-some-odd thousand pounds in last year in a smaller slot limit. And as many people may know, because we were monitoring the fishery carefully, we just issued last week, a week and a half ago, I believe now, an emergency closure on the fishery to ensure that we didn't overshoot the quota by too much.
December 5th, I think.
Okay. I'm losing track of time here.
Okay, thank you. We'll get back. Let's hear, Ralph, from your perspective, what is the state of the striped bass industry?
Well, speaking for the members of the United Fishermen's Association, we came under a ban in 1985. The fishery was, striped bass fishery was closed to us because of PCB contamination. And unlike the East End fishermen, who have seen some relief from the ban because they're being out on the East End, they have cleaner waters, and they had a partial lifting of the ban, and they had a partial open season for the past, I believe it's 2 years, or it might be 3 seasons. Is it 2 or 3? It's 3 seasons now. And but we still have seen no relief on the west end.
How far west? Where does? What's the demarcation point where?
Well, I believe it's Wading River, and west of that line is still under the ban, and east of that point is now open season the fall of the year. But I believe it's going to be increased. The length of the season will be increased, and the season will start in July. Is that correct, Mr. Miller?
Correct. Actually,
next season.
Theoretically this year, but it was too late.
But we see no relief. The West End fishery sees no relief, except for our 12 or so members that we have on the East End, and most of them are charter boat.
Okay, we'll get back to that point George, from your perspective?
Well, recreationally, the striped bass is vital to the economy of the recreational sport fishing industry. The striped bass comes into our waters in May. It sticks around until December. It's one of the few fish which can be targeted recreationally throughout the season. The commercial fishermen have shown us during the 5 years they were not allowed to take those fish during the PCB, problem with the PCBs, that they can survive without taking the striped bass. As a game fish, striped bass will be equal to all the citizens of the state. The fish is a resource of the state and should be treated as such. Game fish status allows everyone the same opportunity to go out and catch a fish.
Okay.
And, I see it as it's vital to a $2 billion economy, which, we contribute $2 billion a year to the local economy, recreational sport fishermen. And when you weigh the two, there's 1.5 million recreational anglers out there each year that are enjoying the sport of striped bass fishing. And history has shown us that a heavy commercial fishery will all but decimate the fish. And we don't want to see it head in that direction again.
Okay. Joe McBride,
Thank
your
you, Jim.
point of view.
To elaborate a little bit on what George has just said, but before I do that, I'd like to make this very clear. It is a position of the Montauk Boatmen's and Captains Association that we are not in favor of a game fish status, nor are we entirely against it, depending on circumstances. It is our contention, as George mentioned, that the fish are a public resource, and this public resource is supposed to be utilized by all the members of a given community. In this case, the striped bass, we're talking about the New York community. Yet at the same time, we realize that this community consists of people other than the immediate people on my boat or your boat or fishing from dock A or dock B or beach A or beach B. And we realize the value of the commercial industry economically, provided that that segment or any other segment is not going to cause a demise of the fish. Under those circumstances, we would be very concerned and would support drastic conservation measures on a temporary basis to see that the fish came back so that all user groups, including commercial fishermen, will be able to make a living full or part-time from these fisheries. What I do want to stress, though, is something that I think we should be concerned about, and that's the economic value of the sport fishing industry on Long Island. And I speak specifically of an industry. I'm not talking about an individual who has nothing to do and takes a rod and goes down to the beach, who's certainly entitled to fish as well as anybody else, according to the philosophy I just espoused. But I'm talking about the people who make a living out of the sport fishing industry. And these people, in their own way, are just as commercial as a man with a net, or a man with a rod and reel, or a man with a dragger, or a man with a charter boat. These people are entitled to make their living. Now, what are they and who are they? According to the Sea Grant Institute, which put out a survey called The Economic Value of Long Island Saltwater Recreational Fishing, and it was done by Professor James R. Kahn of the Department of Economics for the State University of New York, in cooperation with the Sea Grant and New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And there were a number of people who assisted the study maybe 5, 6 years ago. The study finally came out, and I think it's been upgraded since. And without going into a whole economic study, I'd like to say the following: that according to this study, that the value of the sport fishing industry on Long Island is between $1 and $4 billion. Now, the $4 billion would be a multiplier of 2 to 3% of the initial figures of $1 billion. But let's stay with the lower figure of $1 billion industry on Long Island called the sport fishing industry. Now, what is this industry? It employs, according again to Sea Grant, over 10,000 people in the Long Island area alone. I'm not talking about the rest of New York State even, but just on Long Island. And who are they? They're basically small mom and pop businesses. These are not big millionaires with financing big fish operations. They're small people who have tackle shops, marinas, charter boat operators who employ people in their shops and what have you, and such things as restaurants and bars located at fishing docks that are privately owned and depend upon these people going back and forth. By the way, the $1 billion figure I mentioned does not include the sale of boats. That's exclusive of the sale of boats. So we're not even talking about that aspect of it, which is another segment of the industry. So it's important. Does it make it more important than any other industry? Not necessarily. But it certainly makes it an industry, and I use the term industry deliberately, that has to be recognized for the people of Long Island so that we can continue to make a living. These people, these 10,000 plus people, pay taxes, send their children to school, and are part of their community. You can go into some of the ancillary benefits of sport fishing, such as the pleasure, the value of the pleasure brought to the people who do this, the fact that Long Island being a fishing community, whatever that means for a particular individual, attracts residents to pay their taxes, to make their homes here, so they can enjoy their sport of fishing, whether it be on my boat, whether it be on the beach, or whether it be on their own private boat.
Okay, thank you very much. We have different points of view, as you can tell just from our little introductions here, and some interesting and important background information. Why don't we open up to a first question, and I think Joe has already given his point of view on this, but he can reiterate. We'll start with him and go along from right to left. There is some talk about the striped bass fishery being classified as a game fish exclusively, which would exclude commercial fishing. And I believe, Joe, you said that you would not be in favor of that. Instead, you're in favor of conservation. But why don't you spend a minute or two, and then we'll go back around the panel.
Not to be redundant, but as our stand, the Montauk Boatmen's and Captain's stand, that good conservation is good business. That doesn't mean it's restrictive necessarily. It means that a program of proper conservation can provide the resource for all. If our backs were to the wall and our industry was going to be pushed out, then we would not object to game fish status. I've said this at public hearings, and I've said this to the DEC Commissioner Gordon Colvin regarding our position. But we don't want to take that stand. We don't feel that a person should have to go out of business, whether it be commercial, charter, or what have you. And we felt that sting. For a year, we had a moratorium on striped bass, and we had a demonstration out in Montauk initially, in which we hopefully were successful in restoring at least a recreational fishery at that time. And eventually, we feel through some of the conservation ethics of the DEC, we were able to restore a commercial fishery. Now, our captains, in addition to being charter boat captains, are also commercial fishermen to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the success and perhaps the traditions of their particular fishing boat per se. And it's important. It's a big help, at least part-time, to some of the captains, that they be allowed to fish for striped bass and sell them commercially. And it's an important, and I say it's not avarice or greed. It's a necessary part of making a living in the fishing industry. Most fishermen are multifaceted. Lobstermen are chartermen. Lobstermen might work nets, vice versa. Charter boat captains will do a little pin hooking if the occasion arises, and so forth and so on. And we're very blessed on the East End in having waters that are productive, enable us to fulfill what we seek to be in the way of our lifestyle, and that's the style of a fisherman, in my particular case, a charter boat captain.
Okay.
So I hope that sort of put forth our point of view on the issue.
Thank you. George, again, on making the striped bass industry strictly a game fish, how do you and your organization feel about that?
Well, by making the striped bass a game fish, you eliminate the political pressures which are constantly being put on the fisheries managers by the commercial fishermen. Once you take the price tag off the head of the striped bass, you will then get proper fisheries management. I'd like to clear up one thing. By eliminating the sale of striped bass, you're not putting anyone out of work. We are not talking about taking the livelihood away from any one individual. The baymen have made it for a number of years without the striped bass. The hook and line fishermen, the majority, as Joe mentioned, some are part-time charter boat fishermen. Some of them are part-time cops. You know, you got a lot of different guys that are out there just doing this on a part-time basis. There's no one making a substantial amount of money on striped bass. If the baymen are looking to eventually make a larger portion of money on striped bass, that's what resulted in the demise of the bass in the first place, was overharvesting by commercial fishermen. We would like to eliminate that threat and guarantee and assure that there'll be fish in the future.
So you would be in favor of downgrading striped bass from commercial status to specifically game status?
Yes, stop the sale of commercial striped bass. You know, something that needs to be pointed out here is the entire west coast of the United States has game fish for striped bass. 9 of our East Coast states have game fish status for striped bass. This is not a radical idea here, you know, including New Jersey and Connecticut. Both of our neighboring states, they have game fish status for striped bass. Their politicians have recognized the importance of this fishery to their local economy. And we need the same here in New York. And the sportsmen here in New York hopefully will achieve that.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure we'll hear some other points of view.
Yes,
Ralph?
and you will hear them straight away. I personally was a commercial striped bass fisherman. That's all I did. George has just stated that no one has lost their entire, had a livelihood totally dependent on striped bass. Well, I certainly did. I fished 12 years in Australia. I was put out by the PCBs, but those PCB levels have been dropping at a steady rate, and there's a marked decline in PCBs. We're hoping for an opening at any time. And right when we've just spent 8 years tolerating the PCB ban and still surviving. We're faced with game fish status, which would eliminate us altogether from the fishery. And these are small mom-and-pop businesses, that are cottage businesses that are strictly hook and line and don't do really any damage to the population of striped bass. And there's no one that I've spoken to that can honestly look me in the eye and tell me that a hook and a line can do any real damage to a population of striped bass. And all these small businesses would be, absolutely have no hope of recovering and going back into the fishery. As I told you before, we're on the west end, and there are really no other viable species that we can adapt to that would give you the kind of compensation that is, to compensate for the loss of the striped bass.
Okay, thank you. A few of our speakers, Art, have referred to the science and the regulation of the industry. How do you feel about making the striped bass industry a game fish only status?
State of New York.
Right. I know it's hard to talk for the entire state of New York, but has this come before you? Is this on your table?
It may seem hard, but given the circumstances, it's actually kind of easy to speak for the state of New York. Our primary concern, well, the department, it's relatively easy to speak for the Department of Environmental Conservation, as the title suggests, is charged with conserving the resources. And for the striped bass population in the East Coast, severely reduced, we wish to restore the integrity of that population, and the primary mechanism for doing that has been in the fisheries management plan in the latter 80s and the early 90s has been to reduce mortality. And from our perspective, commercial mortality and recreational mortality, they're one and the same. They have the same effect. So we've been regulating by reducing both mortality of both commercial and recreational fishing mortality, and the state law does not authorize us to make it striped bass a game fish or the other way, full commercial fish. And so from our perspective, we're achieving our objectives of restoring the population, and so I have no opinion on the need for game fish.
Okay. Arnold, certainly this is an important issue for you. Let's get your point of view.
First, I have to help Art out. His boss, Commissioner Jorling, has stated in a newspaper article that he wrote that, in fact, the DEC sees no grounds for making striped bass a game fish in New York State. That was in Newsday a few weeks back, Art. And when George
Did I
says...
dance around that too much for you, Arnold?
No, you said the DEC had no position on game fish, but they do, or at least your commissioner does.
Okay.
So, and George, of course, when he says that the baymen are making a living, well, he's quite right. I mean, they're making a living cutting lawns. They're making a living, you know, as carpenters. They're making a living, you know, working for the rich tourists in East Hampton and elsewhere on Long Island. But making a living as baymen, they're not. George just doesn't know the facts. He doesn't know that 7 years ago, we had 150 full-time baymen in the town of East Hampton alone, not counting South Hole and Southampton, you know, Shelter Island, and that today we have less than 30 men who are struggling to remain working on the water full-time. And that part of the answer for these men is to restore to them a meaningful quota of striped bass. Now that, as Art has pointed out, the stock in the Chesapeake has begun to restore itself. The commercial and recreational taking of striped bass has been reopened, and in New York State, we also, by the way, happen to benefit from the stock of striped bass coming from the Hudson River. And one of the problems today for the baymen is that the commercial quota in New York State is based entirely on what we may catch of Chesapeake striped bass and gives us no quota, zero quota of Hudson River stock. And I'm not going to get into the complicated reason, political and scientific, that this is so, but it's an unjust and unnecessary situation and should be corrected. As far as game fish status for striped bass goes, there simply is no reason for making striped bass a game fish, none whatsoever. The same number or even more striped bass will be caught and killed even if they're a game fish. Today, this year, 1992, in 1991 and in 1990, New York State has been allowed to kill about 1.3 million pounds of striped bass. And that's the overall quota of mortality that the Atlantic States Commission seems prepared to accept in New York State. And of course, the plain fact is that each year, the recreational, the sports kill has been over 1 million pounds, and the commercial kill has been somewhere around 200,000 pounds. And so making striped bass a game fish will serve no conservation purpose. I mean, it's only some notion in some people's heads that it'll help, you know, the sport fishermen catch more striped bass. But it's fundamentally, it's nonsense. There is no reason by making game fish that your sports fishermen are going to catch more striped bass. And you will, by making it a game fish, definitely sign the death warrant of this 300-year-old fishing community on the east end of Long Island. So we are, of course, opposed to that status.
Okay, so it's obvious we have a difference of opinion here, which we're going to pursue. We're going to be stopping in just a moment for a break, and we'll come back and we'll pick up with the next question, and we'll continue on these issues in just a few minutes. But we're going to stop now, and we'll pick up where we left off.
These household pollutants play war with our marine environment. Don't attack our marine environment. Dispose of household pollutants properly. For more information, call Cornell Cooperative Extension.
Lyme disease is transmitted by a tick the size of a pinhead, which can attack during a walk in the woods or a park or even in your own backyard. But tick bites can be prevented, and the disease can often be successfully treated, especially in the early stages. The Will Rogers Institute is offering a free booklet to help you learn about Lyme disease. It tells how to recognize the symptoms and the best ways to reduce your chances of getting it. For your free copy, write the Will Rogers Institute, White Plains, New York.
Welcome back, and we're here discussing today the striped bass industry, a panel on the striped bass fishery. And to reintroduce our participants, again to my right is Captain Joe McBride of Montauk. To his left, George Skoka, Ralph Pastore. I'm Jim Daly from the East Hampton Business Alliance, Art Newell from DEC, and Arnold Leo from the East Hampton Town Baymen's Association. So in the first half of our talk, of our panel today, we had a lot of ideas presented, and from this point I'd like to open it up to more of an interchange of the various points that were made. Who would like to? Joe?
If I may, Jim, something I left out in the philosophy of the Montauk Boatmen's and Captains Association regarding fisheries is that while we say these fish are a public resource and we're harvesters of the fish, they're given to the care of various state and federal agencies. In the case of the New York State fishery, the striped bass, amongst others, it's the New York State DEC. And it's their obligation as representatives of the citizenry to see that this fishery is taken care of, conserved, and so forth and so on. Something I think we all pretty well agree to. The disagreement seemed to be in the manner in which the distribution is made now. And it's not necessarily in one user group against the other. I have some severe questions or severe criticisms of the regulations which were told to the DEC prior to this year's forthcoming regulations and were not heeded. For example, while I'm a firm advocate of the rights of all user groups, I'm certainly not going to go out and prostitute either myself or my organization in regard to the net fishery, for example, by allowing a misuse of net licenses by non-net fishermen. It was, if not a moral ground, not a legal ground rather, it was certainly a moral ground that the net fisheries were designed commercially for the net fishermen historically. There are a multitudinous loopholes in that law, in that regulation. And, you know, and on both sides, by the way, including some of the net fishermen. And these regulations should be addressed by the New York State DEC and these loopholes closed. For example, a net fisherman who qualifies, and some of the qualifications for this particular fishery are nebulous, but assuming a person qualifies, and then goes out and catches this fish on rod and reel. Now, this violation, again, if nothing else, takes away from the moral stance that the DEC should have in regarding to enforcement. Some of the rules are completely unenforceable. For example, culling fish. A commercial fisherman, rod and reel or net fisherman, who doesn't want a 28-inch fish or a 24-inch fish, throws it back dead or alive, hopefully alive. It's a violation. It's unenforceable. There's no way you can get onto a boat out in the water and see what's going on with culling a fish. Now, this should be addressed in the forthcoming regulations for 1993. Different licenses.
Are you going to ask me to respond to
Oh,
some
I
of
don't
those
care.
points?
I'm just, you know, you
just
can if you want to do it.
Start to
you up
keep
for a
track of
while.
them. And,
Why don't you, if you have one more
all.
point to make, then we'll let
Well,
Art.
the other, there were a number of other issues. Why don't you respond, and if I have more,
Okay.
if I may, one more very important point.
You're going to have to help me remember, though.
Different tags for the different fisheries. And then again, on enforcement, requirement that the buyers be licensed and the tags be returned by the buyers so that the count will be accurate in determining the closure or whatever of a quota. These are some of the things our people have been concerned with in enforcement.
Let me work backwards if I
Okay.
might remember that best. As you probably know, the department has proposed in the past bills for a buyer's license, and we've supported them, and we would support another bill for a buyer's license. And in fact, the Marine Resources Advisory Council, it's a group of representing the commercial, with representation by the commercial and recreational fishing industry, strongly endorsed and may submit on their own a buyer's license. So you're right, we think that would be a good idea. As far as, I think you mentioned about the tags, yes, we are always looking to improve the tag system to eliminate, as you call it, loopholes that make it easier to possibly abuse that. And for instance, one idea we have, I don't know whether it's feasible, is a removable portion on the tag and going to a sturdier tag. Sturdier tag so that it couldn't be reused, and a removable portion so that once it's used, a part would have to come back, so we get a report right away rather than just knowing that it's used up in the market.
Color coding was another
the
very
culling.
important
Okay,
one.
yes, right, working backwards. When we issued or promulgated this year's regulations in the end of August, and it became effective September 2nd, some of the safeguards that we built in, because we received a lot of comments on that issue, because we have now a wider slot size from 24 to 39 rather than 24 to 29. A lot of people said, yes, there's great potential there for abuse, that is picking larger fish. And we took a number of precautions. Number one, we required that the tags go on the fish right away. Of course, difficult to enforce. Two, we are doing a number, we've increased our monitoring of the markets, independent marketing. The fishermen are required to report the weight of the fish they catch, but we're doing independent monitoring. And also, we made it very clear, this is always the way it's been, but we made it very clear that any overage, that is total weight harvested in excess of the 189,000 pounds, was going to come off of next year's harvest. And in fact, we pointed out that we have the authority, and we wanted to make it clear that we would exercise the authority to close the fishery earlier if we thought that there was going to be an overage. And in fact, that's what we did. Mm-hmm. And we don't know yet just what the overage was. It was a hard decision to make because we don't have day-to-day figures. We had to project what it might be. And we know it's going to go over, but in order to ensure that it doesn't go over so much that it will significantly reduce next year's fishery, we decided to close it earlier. So it might have been one more point which I didn't get to.
Art, on this point though, you say that if we go over the quota this year, then you're going to deduct it from the quota next year. But at the same time, you've already told us, because I asked, what about 1991 and 1990 when we were under the quota? How come we get no credit for that? I mean, in the end, a dead fish is a dead fish. Does it matter if I kill it in 91 or in 92?
Without going into detail on the explanation, basically ASMFC said no.
Yeah, but there's no reason to say no. They say no, but there's no reason to say no. Also, on this overrun this year...
Let me just say that we could probably debate that for a long time, but the bottom line is they said no.
Go ahead, Ralph.
Yeah, I have just two questions that are very important to us on the West End, in the West End fishery, and I'll give you one at a time so you won't have to work back.
You're questioning Art now.
Yes.
Okay, Art seems to be...
Okay. I guess our main concern is, are we getting a PCB study done this year? Is there funding for it? And because we're still, everybody's talking about their allotment of fish and their tags and they've got something going. We have nothing going unless we get a PCB survey that we can say, look, our legislators, our fish are finally clean. Can we have an opening? We can't do that until we get a PCB testing done and another analysis done so that we have some statistics to work with. Can you tell me if that's going to be done this year?
We do not have funding to do another study this year.
That was the same story we got last year.
Well, we don't have funding 2 years in a row. These are difficult financial times.
All right, so that means this is going to be another year that our fishermen have no hope of seeing an opening, even though we believe that the PCBs are low enough right now. According to the 1990 data, the trend was so definite in that direction. There was 7 years in a row that backed a definite trend of these PCBs dropping below 2 parts per million.
But we don't normally monitor every year either.
No, but...
you got to do it every 2 or at the most every 3 years, Art. But look at it this way, Ralph. You see, they don't have any money to do that study, which might put you back to work as a striped bass fisherman. The only way they could get that...
They certainly haven't got any money, don't they?
That's right. The only way they could get it is if they fired a couple of bureaucrats who are working in DEC up in Albany, and then they might have the money to do it. But you tell me which choice DEC is going to make when they have to choose between firing their own members and putting you back to work with a new PCB study.
How much does a study like that cost?
I think the one we did in 1990, I believe, was $250,000.
Yes.
And
I'm sure it would be the same amount.
Is it correct that there
250,000.
has been a declining trend in PCB levels?
Absolutely. Every
Yes.
single year it's gone down. And not only that,
Every year that it's been tested.
every year that it's been tested, it has gone down significantly. But also, what bothers me a lot about it is that we pay a lot of money with our commercial licenses that go into a special, marine resources fund. And that money is there.
What is
And
more
some of it
important?
is being
What
used
could
to pay
possibly be
salaries
more
of
important?
people rather than doing studies like this that might help the commercial fishermen who are paying the money into that fund. So I speak with a certain, gripe to air here.
Ralph, I
understand.
know you had another question.
I have one more question,
Okay,
yes.
and then
I-
we'll
and
see
I-
what's on George's mind.
I'm assuming that the answer to the first question was no, there is no money for the test, so let's go on to the second question. Is there anything being done to ascertain what the relative contribution of the Hudson River stock is to the overall fishery in New York State in contrast to the Chesapeake stock?
Well, there was a study, I think it's 2 years ago now, and it was the best method, and it's still, as far as I know, the best method available for making that distinction. And I believe the conclusion was that the contribution was about 78% of the stock. It was just under the requirement and to enable fishing on that stock, as if it was a separate stock. And
Wait,
but
a correction, Art. It
quite
was
a bit-
just under, perhaps it was just under the requirement to enable New York to base all of its management only on Hudson River stock without any reference to protecting the Chesapeake stock. But in fact, the Hudson contribution to the New York harvest of striped bass is so high that it stands to reason that we should be allowed some portion of our quota to be based on the Hudson River contribution to
The
our
plan,
harvest.
however, requires that a certain percentage be exceeded, which was not exceeded, and therefore the proposal to do as Arnold stated was rejected. And there's no other way to approach that right
Well,
now.
wasn't that a little redundant then to use that method, because nobody really expected it to be any better than that, the results? Why didn't we use the island's protein sampling, which was supposed to be closer to 90%? And if it came up to those expectations, it would have been very usable data.
I can't argue the details right now. I don't have all the information, but as far as I know, that had the best shot at the time. It was not prejudged by us that method was not going to give us a good answer.
George, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I think what you're hearing here is a prime example of the problem that we have with commercial fishing. All these gentlemen are interested in is how many more fish that they can take. When are you going to open up the West End? When are we going to get more fish out on the East End? The day...
But George, let me ask you
Can I
something.
speak?
Why do you want game fish if you don't want
the day
more
that
fish?
the day that
You want more
Arnold
fish,
the day
right?
that the
Let's let
D,
George,
the day that
have
the
his say.
DEC announced their proposals for the increase in striped bass for the commercial fishermen this year, the proposal approximates to about 50% in poundage. That very day, or somewhere within that week, Arnold Leo and the Baymen protested. A 50% increase was not enough for them. You see, they need more fish. In order to make a living, they have to have more fish. And the striped bass fishery is too fragile to sustain what these folks want to do to the fishery in order to make a living. They're going to have to look somewhere else. We used to have market hunters here on the island, used to shoot deer and turkey. You can't do that anymore. And I believe the Baymen someday will go the same way as the market hunters. It's a terrible thing to say, but, I mean, we're headed into the 21st century here. And I think we have to stop talking about what's been going on for 300 years and look at the future.
I'll let Arnold reply to that, but isn't it really a very small universe of baymen? Arnold said before 30 individuals.
Yes.
Doesn't that produce a self-regulating cap on the number of fish that they would take just because there are so few?
Well, not really. You hear them now. They want more fish. And now you're also talking, you know, Ralph Pastore, he's looking here, he's interested in the West End and opening up the fishery over there. It's never ending. They're always going to want more fish. It only stands to reason. The more fish.
We haven't had one fish in 8 years, George. We're
Well-
just looking for some fish.
Well, that's-
You want all the fish.
The whole point is,
game
you
fish
want
status
some
will
fish.
give all the fish to the sport fishing community and allow us none.
It will protect the
You wanna
fish
keep- you wanna
from
keep
what
this up
happened
forever.
in the past. We
You know
want
what,
to.
George?
Let's let Arnold respond, and then Joe. We'll go to Joe.
You know, what Ralph just said is the obvious thing that George can't see. He doesn't want more fish. He wants all the fish. You know, it's like they're not willing to sit down with us, these United Game Fish anglers, and work out a compromise. You know,
We
they
have
want it
never
all.
once asked for more fish. The recreational fisherman has had one fish
is
a day
game fish status?
at
That's not
36
all.
No, no.
inches. We're not asking for more fish.
You want
We're
them
not
all.
saying
You wanna
we
get rid
want
of
2
us,
fish a
right?
day. We're not saying we want 3 fish a day. We're not saying, hey, let's take those 300,000 pounds and give it to the charter boat guys. We do not want any more fish than what we have. We're happy with 1 a day, 36 inches. There's a lot of recreational fishermen which will fish a whole season and put in hundreds of hours of fishing, and they'll be lucky to catch 1 what we call keeper-size fish. So the recreational anglers are not looking for more fish. For
I'd
you
like
to say that is a
finish
lie.
my response, if
Well,
I
yeah,
may,
Arnold.
Okay,
Jim.
Arnold, and then we'll
because
go to
my
Joe.
response has to do also with what George is saying about the commercial fishermen. And I just have to point out that in 1991, each commercial fisherman was given 72 tags. I think it was 72 or 74 tags. That meant for the whole year, 1991, he could catch 74 striped bass.
Within certain.
In 1992, the commercial fishermen were each given 92 tags. So there was an increase from the 74 up to the 92. But 92 tags for a commercial fisherman for the whole year is not, you know, a significant catch. And in this respect, you have to remember that what the commercial fisherman is doing, besides trying to make his living, is providing the millions of consumers who don't have access to fishing with this seafood, which is a very important dietary item for many, many people, and especially such a prized fish as the striped bass should be available to the consumer on a very widespread basis.
Absolutely.
And it is
What George
farm-raised
is talking
striped
about
bass.
is denying those consumers access to that fish.
There's
Okay.
farm-raised. All right.
No, George, we'll try and go around one more round of comments before we sum up. Joe?
You can talk to George, because he and Arnold will have a dialogue. I'll wait till they're
Okay, go ahead,
finished.
George. Very
Well,
gracious of you.
farm-raised striped bass are available. These fish are clean. There are no PCBs. Arnold will have you believe that they're raised in mud. The fact is they're raised in cement tanks. These fish have won many awards for their taste. They taste according to, I spoke with the Chefs of America just 2 weeks ago. Farm-raised striped bass received 4 culinary awards this year, and they taste better than a wild striped bass, and there's guarantee of no PCBs in those fish.
Yeah, but there's all sorts of steroids and antibiotics and all kinds of other drugs that the fish farmer puts in them.
They're
to keep
fed
them-
pelletized.
To keep the disease from spreading in those cement tanks. Furthermore, they're also fed the equivalent of dried cat food. So these culinary awards they win have to do with these sauces that they're smothered in by the cooks. Because I have eaten a farm-raised striped bass, and
So
I
have I.
assure you it tastes like the New
I
York
have eaten it,
Times.
and it tastes just as good, if not better,
I
than a
question
wild
your
We
striped
should have
bass.
samples here tonight.
Well,
We could
I
have-
wish-
disagree with you too, George. I think that
I think you would agree.
They're a freshwater fish. They're not a striped bass at all. And if you buy one, you're getting robbed because you're not buying a striped bass at all. What you're getting is a hybrid, a manufactured striped bass, which tastes nothing like the wild variety, and it has an inferior flavor, and you're paying astronomical prices
You pay
for the
'em-
wrong meat.
They get between $2.25 and $2.75 a pound for the fish, and there's 50,000 pounds a week sold in the state of New York.
No, there's not. There was 240,000
50,000
pounds sold all of last year. George. Come on.
50,000 pounds
Not
a week.
50,000.
According,
$250,000
according to the
pounds for the
Striped Bass
whole
Growers
year.
Association, who again I was speaking to last week, they sell 50,000 pounds a week
Not to New York State.
in New York State.
No.
Okay, let's
Total
see if
was
we
a
can
quarter
address
million pounds last
another
year in
issue
New York.
before we have to leave. Joe?
Well, I was going to make a comment here that no one touched on in regard to the method of fishing. I don't think, and I'll speak again for our organization, that we have great credence in the figures put forth by the DEC in regard to certain types of harvesting figures. Whether or not the, 200 metric tons or 200 pounds of fish commercially were allowed this year, 200,000 pounds?
189,000.
189,000 pounds.
Pounds.
That the calculations are correct. And going back to something you said, Arnold, fact or fiction, the impression that we have is one of the reasons for the, and we consider this to be a fact, one of the reasons for the initial demise was over-harvesting by very efficient haul seine nets. And that concerned us. That doesn't mean they can't come back in or should never come back in, but I think a netting operation is much more efficient than a rod and reel operation, and in our opinion, and certainly we're not experts on it.
Yeah, except that all the many years when both the haul seine and the rod and reel sports fishery were both active, Joe, you should know that the rod and reel sports fishery was always landing more than the haul seiners.
I would hope that
in
a
New
million
York
and a half
State.
people landed
That's right.
more than 5 haul seine
Right,
crews.
but in terms of conservation,
Yeah.
your sports fishery therefore was putting the greater pressure on the striped bass.
We don't believe that. We feel that
The data shows it. I don't care if you believe it or not.
I say it depends on who makes the data and what politician it is.
National
that's guiding
Marine
the fine.
Fisheries Service,
Well,
the only
I
data
don't-
on the board.
There's
National
also data from
Marine
New York State
Fisheries
DEC.
Service.
But in any case, we feel that the efficiency of a haul seine that could, for example, I think if I'm attributing it correctly to you, that it's been stated that the fisheries open for X amount of pounds of fish, and that the commercial fishermen should go out and be able to harvest it till the fisheries closed, without arguing for the moment about how many pounds should be allowed, okay? Well, we feel that is greater good to the commercial fishery in toto and to the sport fishing economy particularly, that if it's a commercial fishery allowed, it's spread about amongst as many people as possible, no one excluding the baymen. It's just that 5 baymen, if there are 5 baymen or 5 baymen's crews, should not get an extraordinary amount of the allotable commercial harvest vis-a-vis the rest of the commercial fishing industry on the East End.
Yeah,
That's
I'd like
our
to
stand.
respond to that, though, because, you know, what you have here is a very difficult question for fisheries managers to deal with. It's the big allocation question. And we'd like to point out, you know, that this great big sports fishing activity that you speak about, not only does it catch more fish of almost every saltwater species that you could name than the commercial fishermen do, but it also entails very large marina operations, very intense use by high-powered gasoline engines of our little estuaries and waterways. It has a very high environmental cost, and it does not provide a social good in the form of a consumer product, which the commercial fishermen do. So you see, when you're a fish manager and you're thinking about how to allocate the resource, you've got to begin to think in terms of the overall social good of the activity.
I'm glad you-
not just in terms
I'm
of
glad
the
you brought it
pleasure
up.
of, you know, certain people
Right.
who have access and money enough to buy great big boats or to hire charter boats and go out on them. That's
I
very
understand.
expensive.
But I think that this, I'm glad you brought that point up. It was, Jim and I, as a matter of fact, recently attended a public hearing in East Hampton town regarding the pollution of Lake Montauk and the various lakes and bodies of water. And I'm surprised that you weren't aware of this, that if the figures were correct from the Long Island Sound study, which we utilized, and we didn't even know before we went to the hearings, because we were as concerned as anybody else about pollution, that 2 to 5% of the pollution in Lake Montauk, 3 Mile Harbor, and any other body of water in the town of East Hampton, and any place on Long Island Sound is caused by boating. The rest of the pollution, 95 plus, is caused by road runoff, farm runoff, etc. Now, so the story about pollution from boats, which, by the way, the industries of marinas and what have you provides infinitesimally more jobs on Long Island than do 5 haul seine crews. And I'm not knocking the 5 haul seine crews, but I will not tolerate our industry being knocked as a an environmentally impure industry, which is not true. We take great strides in the harbor. You've been in the harbor of Montauk, and I'm sure you'll see the sign by the harbor committee saying don't pollute our harbors.
Joe, you know as well as I do that wherever there is a marina, the Environmental Protection Agency requires that within a certain hundred of feet distance around that marina, the grounds be closed to shellfish.
There's absolutely true legally.
Right.
But there's also a reserved area in Lake Montauk 4 or 5 times the size of the marina area, Coonsfoot Cove, that is available and kept sacrosanct for the shellfish industry, as it should be, and no one's objecting.
Yeah, I agree. There are lots of sources of pollution, including outfall sewer pipes from townships that are,
Gentlemen, we're down to our last few minutes. Arnold, since you have the floor, why don't you spend about 40 seconds or so summing up, and we'll move left to right.
Well, to go back to the first thing I said, I think that today the state of New York is actually in a position, there's nothing keeping it from restoring to the traditional baymen the use of the hull seine. There is no evidence to show that it has an adverse impact on fish stocks or on the environment, no evidence at all. In fact, the state DEC hires a hull seine crew each year to catch striped bass on the ocean beach as a part of their survey work. And in 7 years of doing that, they've only killed 1 striped bass. All the others are brought in alive, they're tagged, they're weighed, they're returned to the sea, and they swim away.
Okay, Arnold, I hate to interrupt, but we're running out of time. Art, any last comments?
Notwithstanding the criticisms from both sides on this issue,
You're kind of in the middle today.
I feel
you did a good job.
I feel that we've conducted a reasonably successful season for striped bass, both commercially and recreationally. And yes, we had to close early because the harvest overshot the quota, but I believe we're going to evaluate that, and we'll be able to promulgate issue regulations next year, which will get us a little closer to resolve problems.
Thank you. Ralph, you'd like a new PCB study, but other than that?
Well, other than that, I would like to see a consumer advocate attend one of these meetings, because the consumer is really getting damaged here. He has no voice, and if you make striped bass a game fish, he won't eat striped bass ever again. And they have to have access to striped bass. The consumer deserves access to it. The public in general should demand it.
George, you may differ with that, but about 20
I do
seconds.
differ. I do differ with that. As I said earlier, striped bass is a game fish on the West Coast and in 9 of our states here on the East Coast, including our neighboring states. It's just a matter of time before we have game fish here in New York, and it's the only fair way to provide a resource which is a public resource. It treats everyone fairly. Everyone's allowed to go out and catch their fish.
Okay, Joe, and about 20 seconds or so.
I want to thank you, Jim, and for the sponsors of the show for putting us all together. We all learn a lot at these types of discussions and different points of view. In parting, I'd like to state that it is my hope that, and the hope of the MBCA, that conservation, and I mean, I don't want to use any antagonistic word, enables us all to go back fishing in the traditional ways that Arnold would like, in the ways that Ralph would like, in the ways that George would like, and the fish will be there. It is a job of the DEC to do their best to see that this situation comes back the way it was.
Okay. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Appreciated your time today. Thank you.
Weekday, Meals on Wheels provides a hot dinner and cold supper to approximately 35 clients on the East End. Nearly 100 volunteers are needed each week to pack and deliver the meals. It takes just 1 hour a week. For more information about becoming a volunteer, call Karen at the Meals on Wheels office, 329-1669. That's 329-1669.